Maria Santos had always prided herself on attention to detail. After 15 years climbing the corporate ladder at Meridian Pharmaceuticals, she had earned her reputation as the most thorough senior accountant in the company's finance department. Her corner office on the 32nd floor of the gleaming downtown headquarters offered a spectacular view of the city, but Maria rarely looked up from her computer screens long enough to appreciate it. On that fateful Tuesday morning in March, Maria arrived at the office earlier than usual. The quarterly earnings report was due to the board by Friday, and she wanted to review every number one final time before submission. Meridian stock had been performing exceptionally well, with their new diabetes medication, GlycoEase, generating record-breaking profits. The drug had been hailed as a breakthrough treatment, offering better results with fewer side effects than existing medications. As Maria scrolled through the financial data, something caught her eye. In the research and development expenses for GlycoEase, there was a figure that didn't quite align with her previous calculations. The reported cost for clinical trials was listed as $2.3 million, but her detailed breakdown showed it should have been $23 million. At first, she assumed it was a simple typographical error, the kind that happened when rushing to meet deadlines. She pulled up the original source documents from her secure files, the invoices from the contract research organizations, the payments to clinical sites, the compensation for trial participants. Everything pointed to the higher figure. Maria's pulse quickened as she realized this wasn't just a typo. Someone had deliberately altered the numbers. Her hands trembled slightly as she dug deeper into the financial records. The pattern became clearer with each document she examined. Research and development costs have been systematically understated across multiple drug programs, not just GlycoEase. Manufacturing expenses were similarly manipulated, with costs shifted to subsidiary companies in different reporting periods to smooth out quarterly results. Maria leaned back in her leather chair, her mind racing. Meridian had been reporting artificially inflated profit margins for years, making the company appear far more efficient and profitable than it actually was. This wasn't creative accounting or aggressive interpretation of rules. This was outright fraud. She thought about her colleagues, many of whom had invested their entire retirement savings in Meridian stock based on the company's stellar financial performance. The pension fund held millions of shares. If the true financial picture ever came to light, the stock would crash, wiping out the life savings of thousands of employees and retirees. But that wasn't the worst part. As Maria continued her investigation, she discovered something even more disturbing. The clinical trial data for GlycoEase had been manipulated to hide serious side effects. Internal memos buried deep in the company's servers revealed that early trials had shown a significantly higher risk of heart complications than what had been reported to the Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the lead researcher on the GlycoEase project, had raised concerns about the cardiovascular risks in multiple emails to senior management. Her warnings had been dismissed, and subsequent trial data had been selectively reported to minimize the apparent risks. Patients and doctors prescribing the medication had no idea they were dealing with a drug that could potentially cause heart attacks and strokes. Maria printed out key documents, her hands shaking as she realized the magnitude of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about inflated stock prices or manipulated earnings. People's lives were at stake. Diabetic patients around the world were taking GlycoEase, trusting that it was safe based on the clinical data Meridian had submitted to regulators. She glanced at her family photos on the desk. Her husband Carlos and their two teenage children, Sophia and Miguel. Carlos had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes 3 years ago and was actually taking GlycoEase. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her own husband was potentially at risk because of the company that paid her six-figure salary and provided their comfortable lifestyle. That evening, Maria sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of documents she had brought home. Carlos was in the living room, watching the news with the kids. She could hear them laughing at something on television, the sound of a normal family evening that might soon be shattered by what she had discovered. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor, David Chun. "Great work on the quarterly report, Maria. The board meeting went perfectly." CEO is very pleased with the numbers. Maria felt sick to her stomach. The great work David was praising was built on lies and deception. The board members who had approved the report had no idea they were signing off on fraudulent information. The CEO's pleasure came from misleading investors and endangering patients. She researched whistleblower protections late into the night, reading about other corporate scandals and the fate of the employees who had come forward. The stories were sobering. While some whistleblowers had been vindicated and rewarded, others had faced years of legal battles, career destruction, and personal harassment. Several have been forced to relocate and change their names after receiving death threats. Maria looked at her mortgage statements, her children's college fund, and the comfortable life they had built. Reporting the fraud would likely mean losing her job and facing retaliation from one of the most powerful pharmaceutical companies in the world. Meridian employed an army of lawyers and had unlimited resources to destroy anyone who threatened their business. But she also thought about the patients taking glycoes, trusting that the medication prescribed by their doctors was safe and effective. She thought about the investors, including her own colleagues, who had made financial decisions based on false information. She thought about the clinical researchers like Dr. Kim, whose legitimate concerns have been silenced and buried. The next morning, Maria made copies of the most damning documents and stored them in a safety deposit box at a bank across town. She also uploaded encrypted files to a secure cloud storage service, following the digital security protocols she had researched online. If something happened to her, she wanted to ensure the evidence would survive. At work, she tried to act normally, attending meetings and responding to emails as if nothing had changed. But David Chun seemed to notice something different about her demeanor. "You seem distracted lately, Maria," he said during their weekly one-on-one meeting. "Everything okay at home?" "Just tired," she replied, forcing a smile. "The quarterly crunch always wears me out." David nodded sympathetically. "Well, you've certainly earned some recognition for your excellent work. I'm recommending you for the senior vice president position that's opening up. It would mean a significant salary increase and stock options." The promotion offer felt like a trap, a golden handcuff to ensure her silence. Maria thanked David politely, but inside she felt the weight of the moral dilemma crushing down on her. The company was rewarding her for her complicity in their fraud, offering her even more money and status to keep quiet about what she had discovered. That weekend, Maria drove to visit her elderly mother, Rosa, who lived in a modest apartment in the city's Latino neighborhood where Maria had grown up. Rosa had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, never earning more than minimum wage, but she had always emphasized the importance of honesty and integrity to her daughter. "Mija, you look troubled," Rosa said as they sat on her small balcony, overlooking the bustling street below. "What's bothering you?" Maria wanted to confide in her mother, but she couldn't risk involving her in the dangerous situation. Instead, she asked a hypothetical question. "What would you do if you discovered your employer was doing something terrible, but speaking up would destroy your career and hurt your family?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "When I was young, I worked in a factory where the owner was cheating workers out of their overtime pay. I was afraid to speak up because I needed the job, but then I realized that staying silent made me part of the problem. Sometimes doing the right thing costs us everything, but the cost of doing nothing is even higher." As Maria drove home that evening, her mother's words echoed in her mind. She thought about the patients who didn't have the luxury of choosing between career security and their health. They were counting on companies like Meridian to be honest about the risks and benefits of their medications. They were trusting the system to protect them, and that trust was being violated for profit. Monday morning brought a new crisis. Maria arrived at work to find her computer access restricted and a meeting scheduled with human resources. Her stomach dropped as she realized that somehow her investigation might have been detected. The company's IT security system was sophisticated, and her unusual access patterns to sensitive files might have trigger alerts. In the HR conference room, she faced David Chun and Margaret Walsh, the head of human resources. Their expressions were serious, and Maria prepared herself for the worst. "Maria, we've noticed some irregular activity in your system access logs," David said, his tone professional but cold. "You've been accessing files outside your normal responsibilities, including clinical trial data and internal communications. Can you explain why?" Maria's mind raced. She could lie, claim she was conducting routine financial analysis that required broader access to company data, or she could tell the truth and face immediate termination and potential legal action. The moment she had been dreading had arrived sooner than expected. "I was investigating some discrepancies in our reported research and development costs," she said carefully. "I wanted to make sure our financial statements were accurate." Margaret leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Those discrepancies were already reviewed and approved by senior management. Your job is to compile and report the numbers you're given, not to conduct unauthorized investigations into company operations." "But the numbers are wrong," Maria said, her voice stronger than she felt. "The clinical trial costs for glycoes were deliberately understated by more than $20 million. And that's just the beginning of what I found." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. David and Margaret exchanged a meaningful look that confirmed Maria's worst fears. They already knew about the fraudulent reporting. They were part of it. "Maria, you're clearly under a lot of stress," Margaret said, her tone shifting to fake concern. "I think you need to take some time off to get your bearings. We're placing you on administrative leave, effective immediately. You'll need to surrender your access cards and company laptop." Maria realized this was her last chance to gather additional evidence before being completely cut off from the company systems. "I'd like to finish reviewing the quarterly report first. There might be other errors that need correction." "That won't be necessary," David said firmly. "The report has already been filed with the SEC. Your services are no longer needed on this project." As security escorted Maria from the building, she felt the eyes of her colleagues watching from the windows above. Some looked confused, others sympathetic, but none made any move to help her. In the corporate world, self-preservation trumped loyalty every time. Sitting in her car in the parking garage, Maria realized there was no going back. Meridian had shown their hand by placing her on leave so quickly after her inquiries. They knew she had discovered their fraud, and they were taking steps to silence her. Her comfortable career was over, but her fight for justice was just beginning. She pulled out her personal cell phone and dialed the number for the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower hotline. Her hands were shaking as she waited for someone to answer, knowing that the next word she spoke would change her life forever. The SEC's whistleblower hotline transferred Maria to Agent Sarah Mitchell, a seasoned investigator who had handled numerous corporate fraud cases. Sarah's voice was professional, but warm as she explained the process and the protections available to whistleblowers under federal law. "What you're describing is very serious, Ms. Santos," Sarah said after Maria outlined her discoveries. "We'll need you to provide documentation to support your claims. Can you do that safely?" Maria thought about the documents in her safety deposit box and the encrypted files in cloud storage. "Yes, I have extensive evidence. Financial records, internal emails, clinical trial data, everything showing the fraud and the cover-up of safety issues." "Good. But I need to warn you, cases like this can take years to resolve. The company will likely fight back aggressively, and you'll need to be prepared for a long battle. Do you have a lawyer?" Maria hadn't thought about legal representation. Her comfortable salary at Meridian had never required her to think about such things. "Not yet, but I'll find one." Sarah provided Maria with contact information for attorneys who specialized in whistleblower cases and recommended that she document everything going forward. Phone calls, meetings, any contact from Meridian employees. All of it could be relevant to the investigation. Over the next several days, Maria met with 3 different attorneys before settling on Rebecca Torres, a former federal prosecutor who had built a successful practice representing corporate whistleblowers. Rebecca's office was modest compared to the gleaming corporate towers where Maria had spent her career, but the walls were lined with newspaper clippings documenting her victories against powerful companies. The good news is that you have strong documentary evidence, Rebecca said after reviewing Maria's files. The bad news is that Meridian will do everything possible to discredit you and make your life miserable. They have virtually unlimited resources and a strong motivation to silence you. Rebecca explained the legal landscape. Under the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the False Claims Act, Maria was protected from retaliation for reporting securities fraud and making false claims to government agencies. If the SEC's investigation led to a successful enforcement action, she could receive a percentage of any financial penalties imposed on the company. But the money isn't guaranteed, Rebecca warned. And even with legal protections, retaliation happens all the time. Companies are creative about finding ways to make whistleblowers' lives difficult without technically violating the law. As if to prove Rebecca's point, Maria's troubles began almost immediately. Her administrative leave from Meridian was extended indefinitely, but her health insurance was suddenly canceled due to what HR called a processing error. Her mortgage company received an anonymous tip claiming she had inflated her income on her loan application, triggering a financial review that froze her credit. Most disturbing of all, her husband Carlos received a call at his office from someone claiming to be conducting a background check for a security clearance Maria had supposedly applied for. The caller asked detailed questions about Maria's mental health, her financial situation, and her loyalty to her employers. "I didn't apply for any security clearance," Maria told Rebecca during an emergency meeting. "Someone is fishing for information about me, probably looking for ammunition to use against my credibility." Rebecca nodded grimly. "This is exactly the kind of intimidation tactic we expected. We need to document everything and report it to the SEC. These actions could constitute witness tampering and obstruction of justice." Meanwhile, the SEC's investigation was moving forward slowly but steadily. Agent Mitchell had assigned a team of forensic accountants and securities lawyers to review Maria's evidence and conduct their own analysis of Meridian's financial statements. They confirmed that the research and development costs have been systematically understated, creating the false impression of higher profit margins. More concerning was their analysis of the clinical trial data. Independent medical experts hired by the SEC concluded that glycoes carried a significantly higher risk of cardiovascular complications than Meridian had disclosed to the FDA. The company's own internal safety monitoring had identified the risks early in the development process, but senior management had decided to downplay the findings to avoid delays in getting the drug to market. "We estimate that glycoes generates about $2 billion in annual revenue for Meridian," Agent Mitchell explained to Maria during a secure conference call. They had every incentive to hide the safety problems and get the drug approved as quickly as possible. The human cost of Meridian's deception was becoming clear as well. The SEC's investigation had uncovered reports of heart attacks and strokes among glycoes patients that had never been properly reported to the FDA's adverse event database. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the researcher who had originally raised safety concerns, had been quietly transferred to a different division, and her access to glycoes data had been terminated. Maria arranged to meet Dr. Kim through an intermediary, a former Meridian employee who had left the company in frustration over ethical concerns. They met at a small coffee shop in a suburban shopping center, far from Meridian's downtown headquarters. Dr. Kim was a slight woman in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes. She spoke quietly, constantly glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I've been waiting for someone like you to come forward," Dr. Kim said. "I documented everything. The safety signals we found, the meetings where management told us to downplay the risks, the pressure to manipulate the data analysis. But I was afraid to speak up alone." She pulled a small flash drive from her purse and slid it across the table to Maria. "This contains copies of my original safety reports and the internal emails showing how the data was manipulated. I've been carrying it around for months, hoping I'd find the courage to do something with it." The flash drive contained a treasure trove of evidence that confirmed everything Maria had suspected. Dr. Kim's original clinical reports showed clear cardiovascular risks, but revised versions submitted to the FDA have been altered to minimize these findings. Internal emails revealed pressure from marketing and senior management to reframe the safety data to support FDA approval. One email from Meridian's chief medical officer was particularly damning. The cardiovascular signals are concerning, but we need to remember that diabetes itself carries heart risks. If we can position any cardiac events as related to underlying diabetes rather than drug side effects, we should be able to get approval. Armed with this new evidence, the SEC expanded its investigation and began coordinating with the FDA and the Department of Justice. Criminal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy were being considered, along with civil penalties that could run into the billions of dollars. But Meridian wasn't sitting passively while the investigation proceeded. The company hired one of the nation's top white-collar defense firms and began an aggressive campaign to discredit Maria and undermine the investigation. Private investigators began following Maria and her family members. Her children were approached at school by strangers asking questions about their mother's behavior and mental state. Carlos was questioned by HR at his own job about Maria's erratic behavior and financial problems. Most troubling of all, someone leaked Maria's identity as the whistleblower to a financial blogger who was known to be sympathetic to pharmaceutical companies. The blog post portrayed Maria as a disgruntled employee who had been placed on leave for poor performance and was now making false accusations to get revenge on her former employer. Desperate former Meridian employee makes baseless accusations to cover her own failures, read the headline. The article included selective quotes from Maria's personnel file and unflattering details about her personal finances. Within hours, the story had been picked up by other financial websites and social media accounts. Maria's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters asking for comment. Her neighbors began looking at her suspiciously, and her children faced embarrassing questions at school. "This is exactly what they want," Rebecca told Maria during an emergency strategy session. "They're trying to make you so miserable that you'll give up and withdraw your complaint. We can't let them succeed." Rebecca filed a motion with the court seeking an injunction against Meridian's intimidation tactics, but the legal process moved slowly while the harassment continued daily. Maria's family life was falling apart under the strain. Carlos, though supportive, was struggling with the stress of being under constant surveillance. Their teenage children were angry and embarrassed by the negative publicity. "Why did you have to get involved in this?" Sophia, their 17-year-old daughter, asked during a particularly difficult family dinner. "We had a good life before you started making trouble." Maria tried to explain that she hadn't had a choice, that people were being hurt by Meridian's lies, but her children weren't interested in moral arguments. They just wanted their normal life back. The pressure intensified when Maria received a certified letter from Meridian's legal department. The company was suing her for breach of contract, theft of proprietary information, and violation of her confidentiality agreement. They demanded return of all company documents and sought monetary damages for the harm to their reputation. "This is a slap suit," Rebecca explained. "Strategic litigation against public participation. They're not expecting to win, but they want to tie you up in expensive litigation and drain your resources." The lawsuit meant Maria would face years of depositions, document production, and legal fees even before the SEC's investigation was complete. Meridian's lawyers were already demanding access to her personal financial records, her communications with the SEC, and her psychological treatment records. "They're fishing for anything they can use to undermine your credibility," Rebecca warned. "This is going to get much worse before it gets better." As winter turned to spring, Maria found herself living in a strange parallel universe. On one hand, she was working closely with federal investigators who validated her discoveries and praised her courage in coming forward. Agent Mitchell regularly updated her on the progress of the investigation, which was expanding to include other Meridian drugs and potentially criminal charges against senior executives. On the other hand, her daily life had become a nightmare of harassment, legal threats, and financial pressure. Her administrative leave had ended with her termination from Meridian, officially for performance issues, but clearly in retaliation for her whistleblowing. Her new legal bills were mounting faster than her savings could cover them, and other pharmaceutical companies had made it clear she was blacklisted from the industry. The stress was taking its toll on her health as well. Maria lost weight, couldn't sleep, and found herself constantly looking over her shoulder for private investigators or other threats. Her family doctor prescribed anti-anxiety medication, but the pills only provided temporary relief from the constant pressure. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday in May. Agent Mitchell called with news that would change everything. "We've got him," she said, her voice crackling with excitement. Meridian CEO, David Harrison, just agreed to cooperate with our investigation. He's going to testify against the other senior executives and provide evidence about the conspiracy to hide glycoE's safety problems. Harrison's cooperation had been secured through a plea agreement that would allow him to avoid the most serious criminal charges in exchange for his testimony. More importantly, his decision to flip had triggered an avalanche of cooperation from other Meridian executives who were now racing to cut their own deals with prosecutors. "The whole house of cards is coming down," Agent Mitchell continued. "We have executives testifying about orders to manipulate clinical data, hide safety information, and mislead investors. Your evidence was the key that unlocked everything." Within days, the news broke publicly. Federal agents raided Meridian's headquarters, seizing documents and computers. Trading in the company's stock was suspended as the full extent of the fraud became clear. The Justice Department announced criminal charges against 6 senior executives, while the SEC filed civil fraud charges seeking billions in penalties. Dr. Jennifer Kim's courage in providing additional evidence had also been crucial. She was granted whistleblower protection and had agreed to testify at the criminal trials. Her original safety reports, which clearly showed glycoE's cardiovascular risks, would be key evidence in proving that Meridian had knowingly endangered patients. The vindication felt good, but Maria knew the fight was far from over. Meridian's bankruptcy would likely wipe out the stock holdings of thousands of employees and retirees. Patients who had suffered heart attacks and strokes while taking glycoEs were filing lawsuits seeking compensation for their injuries. The entire pharmaceutical industry was facing increased scrutiny from regulators and investors. Most importantly, the question remained whether the system could be reformed to prevent future fraud and protect patients from dangerous drugs. Maria's courage in coming forward had exposed one case of corporate misconduct, but she knew there were likely others still hidden behind the walls of pharmaceutical companies around the world. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago buzzed with activity as reporters, lawyers, and spectators gathered for what was being called the trial of the decade. United States v. Harrison et al. Would determine the fate of 6 former Meridian Pharmaceuticals executives accused of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to endanger public health. Maria Santos adjusted her navy blue suit as she waited in the witness preparation room. After 18 months of investigation, depositions, and legal battles, she was finally ready to tell her story under oath. The weight of responsibility felt enormous. Her testimony could help send corporate executives to prison and recover billions of dollars for defrauded investors and injured patients. Rebecca Torres sat across from her, reviewing key documents one final time. "Remember, just tell the truth," she coached. "The defense attorneys will try to rattle you, but you have the facts on your side. Stick to what you know from the documents and your personal experience." Through the small window, Maria could see protesters gathered on the courthouse steps. Some carried signs supporting corporate accountability and patient safety. Others, funded by pharmaceutical industry groups, argued that the prosecution was an anti-business witch hunt that would stifle medical innovation. Assistant U.S. Attorney James Rodriguez had spent months preparing Maria's testimony. He was a veteran prosecutor who had built his career taking on white-collar crime, and he understood the importance of Maria's credibility to the government's case. "The defense is going to paint you as a disgruntled employee who fabricated evidence to get revenge on your former employer," Rodriguez had warned during their preparation sessions. They'll point to your performance reviews, your financial problems after being fired, your mental health treatment. We need to address all of that head-on. The prosecution strategy was to present Maria as a reluctant hero who had discovered fraud almost by accident and had risked everything to protect patients and investors. Her personal sacrifices, the lost career, the financial hardship, the harassment by private investigators, would demonstrate her credibility and commitment to the truth. When Maria was called to testify, the courtroom fell silent. Judge Patricia Williams, a respected federal judge with a reputation for fairness, reminded the jury that they were hearing from the key witness whose discoveries had launched the entire investigation. Maria placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. As she settled into the witness chair, she made eye contact with the defendants sitting at the defense table. CEO David Harrison looked older and grayer than when she had last seen him at company meetings. His plea agreement had made him a prosecution witness, but the other 5 executives were fighting the charges. Chief Financial Officer Michael Chun, her former boss David's brother, stared at her with undisguised hostility. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Patricia Walsh avoided her gaze entirely, focusing on documents spread before her. Maria recognized several other faces from Meridian's executive suite, people who had once smiled and chatted with her at company events. Prosecutor Rodriguez began with Maria's background, establishing her credentials and her role at Meridian. 15 years with the company, consistent performance evaluations, no history of conflicts with management. She had been a model employee until she discovered the fraud. Ms. Santos, can you tell the jury what you found when you were reviewing the quarterly earnings report in March of 2025? Rodriguez asked. Maria took a deep breath and began her story. She described finding the discrepancy in research and development costs for glycoes, her initial assumption that it was a simple error, and her growing realization that the numbers had been deliberately manipulated. As she spoke, the prosecution displayed key documents on large screens throughout the courtroom. Financial spreadsheets with altered figures, internal emails discussing the need to manage reported costs, and clinical trial data that have been selectively edited to hide safety problems. When you discovered that clinical trial costs have been understated by more than $20 million, what did you do? Rodriguez continued. I investigated further, Maria replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. I accessed additional financial records and discovered a pattern of cost manipulation across multiple drug programs. Research expenses were being shifted between reporting periods to inflate profit margins. The testimony continued for hours, with Maria methodically walking through her discoveries. She explained how she had uncovered the manipulation of glycoes clinical data, the suppression of DR, Jennifer Kim's safety reports, and the conspiracy to hide cardiovascular risks from the FDA. Rodriguez displayed internal emails that showed senior executives discussing how to reframe safety data to avoid regulatory delays. One particularly damning message from Chief Medical Officer Dr. Walsh read, "The cardiovascular signals are manageable if we focus on the underlying diabetes risk factors rather than drug-related effects. Marketing needs this approval by fourth quarter." Dr. Walsh knew that glycoes was causing heart problems, but she was more concerned about meeting marketing deadlines than protecting patients, Maria testified. The internal safety data clearly showed increased risks, but that information was never shared with the FDA or the prescribing physicians. The most emotional part of Maria's testimony came when Rodriguez asked about her decision to become a whistleblower. Her voice wavered slightly as she described the moral dilemma she had faced. I thought about my husband, who was taking glycoes for his diabetes, she said. I thought about all the patients who trusted their doctors and the FDA to keep them safe. I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in endangering their lives. The cross-examination began the following morning. Defense attorney Margaret Foster, representing Dr. Walsh, attacked Maria's motivations and credibility with surgical precision. Ms. Santos, you were placed on administrative leave before you made your allegations, weren't you? Foster asked. Yes, but only after I began investigating the discrepancies I had found. And you had been struggling with performance issues for several months prior to that, hadn't you? Rebecca had prepared Maria for this line of questioning. I had received some criticism about missed deadlines, but my overall performance evaluations were positive. The administrative leave came immediately after I questioned the accuracy of our financial reports. Foster pressed harder, introducing Maria's personnel file and highlighting negative comments from supervisors. She suggested that Maria had fabricated the fraud allegations to deflect attention from her own professional shortcomings. Isn't it true that you were facing possible termination for poor performance when you decided to make these accusations? No, that's not true, Maria replied firmly. I was investigating financial irregularities as part of my job responsibilities. I was placed on leave specifically because I was asking questions about the accuracy of our reports. The defense attorney then shifted to Maria's financial situation, suggesting that she had been motivated by the prospect of receiving a whistleblower reward from the SEC. You stand to receive millions of dollars if the government's case is successful, don't you? Any reward would be determined by the SEC based on their investigation, Maria answered. But I didn't know about potential rewards when I first reported what I found. I was focused on protecting patients and investors from fraud. Foster continued the attack for 2 full days, questioning Maria's mental health, her family relationships, and her interpretation of the documents. She suggested that Maria had misunderstood complex financial transactions and had jumped to conclusions about innocent business practices. But Maria held firm. She had spent months preparing for these questions, and her answers remained consistent and credible. When Foster suggested that the clinical trial manipulation was actually standard practice in the pharmaceutical industry, Maria pushed back strongly. Hiding safety data from regulators is never standard practice, she said. Patients have the right to know the true risks and benefits of their medications. What Meridian did endangered lives for the sake of profits. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by the testimony of Dr. Jennifer Kim, who confirmed Maria's account of the clinical trial manipulation. Dr. Kim had brought her own copies of the original safety reports, showing clear evidence of cardiovascular risks that had been minimized in the final submissions to the FDA. I was told repeatedly by senior management that my safety concerns were overblown, Dr. Kim testified. When I persisted in raising these issues, I was transferred to a different division and my access to glycoEase data was terminated. CEO David Harrison's testimony under his plea agreement was devastating to the remaining defendants. He admitted that senior executives had made a deliberate decision to hide glycoEase safety problems to avoid regulatory delays and protect the company's stock price. We knew there were cardiovascular risks, Harrison testified. Dr. Walsh briefed the executive committee on the safety signals, but we decided that the benefits outweighed the risks. We thought we could manage the issue through careful marketing and physician education. When asked about the financial fraud, Harrison was equally damaging to his former colleagues. Michael Chun was the architect of the cost manipulation scheme. He developed the accounting techniques we used to shift expenses between reporting periods and inflate our profit margins. The defense's case relied primarily on attacking the credibility of the government's witnesses and arguing that any accounting irregularities were the result of legitimate business judgment rather than criminal intent. They portrayed the defendants as dedicated professionals who had made difficult decisions in a highly regulated industry. Dr. Walsh's attorney argued that clinical trial interpretation was subjective and that reasonable medical professionals could disagree about the significance of safety signals. Michael Chin's lawyer claimed that the financial reporting techniques were aggressive, but legal methods of managing quarterly earnings fluctuations. But the documentary evidence was overwhelming. Internal emails, safety reports, and financial records painted a clear picture of deliberate deception and fraud. The defendants' own words, preserved in company communications, contradicted their claims of innocent intent. The trial lasted 6 weeks, with dozens of witnesses and hundreds of exhibits. Expert witnesses testified about pharmaceutical regulation, financial reporting standards, and the impact of the fraud on patients and investors. Victims of glycoe side effects gave emotional testimony about heart attacks and strokes that they attributed to the medication. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Rodriguez focused on the human cost of Meridian's deception. He displayed photographs of patients who had died from cardiovascular complications while taking glycoes, arguing that their deaths could have been prevented if the true safety data had been disclosed. The defendants put profits over patients, Rodriguez told the jury. They knew glycoes was dangerous, but they hid that information to protect their stock price and their bonuses. Maria Santos risked her career and her family's security to expose this fraud because she understood that lives were at stake. Defense attorney Foster made one final attempt to discredit Maria's testimony, arguing that she was an unreliable witness motivated by personal grievance and financial reward. But her arguments rang hollow against the weight of documentary evidence and corroborating testimony. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. As the foreman rose to announce their decision, the packed courtroom fell completely silent. Maria felt her heart pounding as she waited to learn whether her 18 months of sacrifice and struggle had been worthwhile. On the charge of securities fraud, we find the defendant Michael Chin guilty. The foreman continued reading verdicts for each defendant and each charge. All 5 remaining executives were convicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and endangering public health. The convictions carried potential sentences of decades in prison and millions of dollars in fines. Maria felt a mixture of relief and validation as she listened to the verdicts. The jury had believed her testimony and had seen through the defense's attempts to discredit her. The evidence she had discovered and preserved had been the foundation for holding corporate executives accountable for their crimes. But even as she celebrated the legal victory, Maria knew that the broader fight was far from over. Meridian Pharmaceuticals had declared bankruptcy, leaving thousands of employees without jobs and wiping out retirement savings invested in company stock. Patients injured by glycoes faced years of litigation to seek compensation for their medical expenses and suffering. Outside the courthouse, Maria was surrounded by reporters seeking her reaction to the verdicts. She had prepared a brief statement with Rebecca's help, focusing on the need for continued vigilance to protect patients and investors from corporate fraud. Today's verdicts send a clear message that executives who endanger patients and defraud investors will be held accountable, she said. But we cannot rely solely on whistleblowers to police the pharmaceutical industry. We need stronger regulations, better oversight, and a commitment to putting patient safety before profits. As the crowd of reporters dispersed, Maria felt the weight of the past 18 months settling on her shoulders. She had accomplished what she set out to do, exposing fraud and holding criminals accountable. But the personal cost had been enormous, and the broader problems in the pharmaceutical industry remained largely unchanged. The journey from corporate accountant to federal witness had transformed Maria in ways she was still discovering. She had learned that doing the right thing often came with a steep price, but that the alternative, remaining silent in the face of injustice, was ultimately more costly to society and to her own conscience. The verdicts were just the beginning of a new phase in her life, one where she would need to rebuild her career and help her family heal from the trauma of the past year and a half. But for the first time since discovering that misplaced decimal point in the quarterly report, Maria Santos felt that justice had been served. 6 months after the verdicts, Maria Santos stood at the podium of the Senate Health Committee hearing room, preparing to testify before Congress about pharmaceutical industry reform. The marble halls of the Capitol building felt surreal after everything she had endured, but her presence there represented the culmination of her transformation from corporate employee to public advocate. The hearing room was packed with journalists, lobbyists, and activists. Pharmaceutical industry representatives sat in the front rows, their expensive suits and stern expressions a reminder that the fight for reform would be long and difficult. Patient advocacy groups filled the gallery, many holding photographs of loved ones who have been harmed by unsafe medications. Senator Patricia Martinez, the committee chairwoman, had made pharmaceutical accountability a centerpiece of her legislative agenda following the Meridian scandal. The convictions of the Meridian executives had provided momentum for sweeping reforms, but the industry was fighting back with armies of lobbyists and millions of dollars in campaign contributions. Ms. Santos, your courage in exposing the Meridian fraud has saved countless lives and protected investors from billions in losses, Senator Martinez said as she introduced Maria. We're here today because the current system failed to detect this fraud for years. What changes do you recommend to prevent future scandals? Maria looked out at the packed hearing room, thinking about all the people whose lives have been affected by Meridian's crimes. Her husband Carlos sat in the front row, having taken time off work to support her testimony. Dr. Jennifer Kim was also present, having become a close ally in their shared fight for pharmaceutical reform. Thank you, Senator Martinez, Maria began. The Meridian case revealed fundamental weaknesses in how we regulate pharmaceutical companies and protect patients. The current system relies too heavily on companies self-reporting safety problems and accurately disclosing financial information. We need independent oversight with real enforcement power. Maria's prepared testimony outlined 5 key reforms: mandatory independent safety monitoring for all clinical trials, criminal penalties for executives who knowingly hide safety data, stronger whistleblower protections with guaranteed anonymity, regular forensic audits of pharmaceutical companies' financial reports, and public disclosure of all clinical trial data within 30 days of completion. The pharmaceutical industry will argue that these reforms will stifle innovation and increase drug costs, Maria continued. But the real cost is measured in human lives lost and families destroyed by preventable adverse effects. Innovation means nothing if patients can't trust that their medications are safe and effective. The committee members took turns questioning Maria about her recommendations and her experience as a whistleblower. Several Republican senators, clearly briefed by pharmaceutical lobbyists, challenged her proposals as government overreach that would harm American competitiveness in global markets. Ms. Santos, your proposed reforms would essentially treat all pharmaceutical companies as criminals, said Senator Robert Hayes of Texas. Don't you think that's an overreaction based on one bad actor? Maria had anticipated this line of questioning. Senator Hayes, Meridian wasn't a rogue company. They were respected industry leaders with all the same oversight and regulations that apply to other pharmaceutical companies. If the current system couldn't detect and prevent their fraud, we have to assume that similar problems exist elsewhere. She was right. In the months following the Meridian convictions, SEC investigations had uncovered accounting irregularities at 3 other major pharmaceutical companies. FDA reviews of clinical trial data had identified safety problems that had been minimized or hidden in drug applications. The Meridian case had opened a Pandora's box of industry-wide misconduct. Senator Martinez asked Maria to describe the personal cost of becoming a whistleblower, hoping to highlight the need for stronger protections for future witnesses. Senator, I lost my career, my financial security, and nearly lost my family, Maria replied. The retaliation was swift and comprehensive. Meridian used private investigators, frivolous lawsuits, and character assassination to try to silence me. Without strong legal representation and the support of federal prosecutors, I would have been destroyed. The emotional weight of Maria's testimony was evident in her voice as she described the 18 months of harassment and intimidation. Several committee members appeared moved by her account, while the pharmaceutical lobbyists in the audience took notes for their own counterarguments. We need to make it safe for employees to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation, Maria continued. Anonymous reporting systems, guaranteed legal representation, and severe penalties for companies that retaliate against whistleblowers. No one should have to sacrifice their livelihood to protect public safety. Dr. Kim testified after Maria, providing the medical perspective on pharmaceutical fraud and safety issues. Her clinical expertise added weight to the reform proposals, particularly regarding independent safety monitoring and public disclosure of trial data. Physicians and patients make treatment decisions based on the information provided by pharmaceutical companies, Dr. Kim explained. When that information is incomplete or misleading, we can't provide appropriate care. I've seen too many patients suffer complications that could have been prevented with full disclosure of safety data. The hearing continued for 6 hours, with testimony from former FDA officials, medical researchers, patient advocates, and pharmaceutical industry representatives. The industry witnesses argued that existing regulations were sufficient and that additional oversight would delay life-saving treatments and increase costs for patients. Dr. Angela Morrison, representing the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers Association, painted Maria's proposals as anti-business extremism. The Meridian case was an isolated incident involving a few bad actors, she argued. The vast majority of pharmaceutical companies operate with the highest ethical standards and are committed to patient safety. But Maria's response was pointed and well-documented. Dr. Morrison, in the past year alone, the SEC has identified accounting fraud at 3 major pharmaceutical companies. The FDA has found hidden safety data in the applications of 12 approved drugs. The Justice Department is investigating clinical trial manipulation at multiple companies. This is not an isolated incident. It's a pattern of systematic deception. The statistics Maria cited came from her new role as a consultant to the Government Accountability Office, where she had been hired to help investigate pharmaceutical industry practices. Her experience at Meridian had made her an expert in detecting financial fraud and safety data manipulation. After the hearing, Maria was approached by representatives from several patient advocacy groups who wanted her help with their own cases against pharmaceutical companies. She had become an unofficial clearinghouse for information about industry misconduct, with current and former pharmaceutical employees regularly contacting her with evidence of wrongdoing. One of the most significant cases involved Dr. Sarah Chun, a former clinical researcher at BioCore Pharmaceuticals who had discovered that her company was suppressing data about severe psychiatric side effects in a new antidepressant. The drug had already been approved and was being prescribed to millions of patients, including adolescents and young adults. They've buried my safety reports just like Meridian did with GlycoEase, Dr. Chin told Maria during a confidential meeting. The psychiatric side effects include increased suicide risk in young patients, but that information never made it to the FDA. People are dying because of this cover-up. Maria connected Dr. Chun with Rebecca Torres and Agent Sarah Mitchell, helping to launch another federal investigation. The pattern was depressingly familiar: altered clinical data, suppressed safety reports, and financial manipulation to hide the true costs of development and marketing. The BioCore case would eventually lead to criminal charges against 4 executives and a $3.2 billion settlement with the Justice Department. But the personal cost to Dr. Chun was similar to what Maria had experienced: career destruction, financial hardship, and years of legal battles. These experiences reinforced Maria's belief that systemic reform was necessary to protect both patients and potential whistleblowers. Individual prosecutions weren't enough to change an industry culture that prioritized profits over safety. The congressional hearing had generated significant media attention and public pressure for reform, but the legislative process moved slowly. The pharmaceutical industry's lobbying efforts were intense and well-funded, with former FDA officials and retired members of Congress working to water down or defeat proposed reforms. Maria found herself at the center of this political battle, testifying at additional hearings and meeting with lawmakers to discuss specific reform proposals. She had never imagined becoming a public figure, but her expertise and credibility made her a valuable advocate for change. The personal toll remained significant. Despite the SEC whistleblower award that had provided financial security, she ultimately received $47 million from the government's recovery of penalties from Meridian. Maria struggled with the ongoing stress and public attention. Her marriage to Carlos had survived, but it required ongoing counseling and rebuilding of trust. Their children had been particularly affected by the publicity and harassment. Sophia, now in college, had chosen to attend school under a different name to avoid association with the case. Miguel had struggled with anxiety and required therapy to deal with the trauma of his family's ordeal. "Sometimes I wonder if it was worth it," Maria confided to Rebecca during one of their regular check-ins. "We stopped one company from hurting patients, but there are dozens of others doing similar things. The system hasn't really changed." Rebecca, who had become more than just Maria's attorney, understood the psychological burden of taking on powerful institutions. "Change is slow, but it is happening," she reminded Maria. "The BioCore case came to light because of your example. Other whistleblowers are coming forward because you showed it was possible to win. Every case makes the next one easier." Indeed, the landscape was slowly shifting. The Meridian case had inspired new legislation in several states requiring pharmaceutical companies to disclose all clinical trial data and establishing independent safety monitoring boards. The SEC had created a new division focused specifically on pharmaceutical industry fraud, with forensic accountants trained to detect the kinds of manipulation Maria had uncovered. Most significantly, the FDA had implemented new rules requiring real-time disclosure of safety data and independent verification of clinical trial results. Dr. Kim had been hired as a senior advisor to help develop these new protocols, bringing her firsthand experience with industry misconduct to bear on regulatory reform. But the work was far from finished. Maria's consulting role with the GAO had revealed that the problems extended beyond just safety data and financial fraud. Pharmaceutical companies were manipulating patent systems to maintain monopolies, engaging in anti-competitive practices to suppress generic alternatives, and using patient assistance programs to mask the true cost of medications. At a medical conference in San Francisco, Maria was approached by Dr. Marcus Johnson, a former executive at 3 major pharmaceutical companies who had witnessed systematic misconduct at each one. "I've been following your work," Dr. Johnson said. "I have evidence of price-fixing conspiracies involving insulin and other diabetes medications. Companies are coordinating to keep prices artificially high while patients ration their medications and die from lack of access." The insulin price-fixing case would become Maria's next major investigation, involving coordination between multiple companies to maintain high prices for life-saving medications. The conspiracy had resulted in diabetic patients paying thousands of dollars per month for insulin that cost less than $10 to manufacture. As Maria prepared to dive into this new case, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that Tuesday morning when she discovered the misplaced decimal point. She had lost her comfortable corporate career, but had gained something more valuable: the knowledge that she had made a difference in protecting patients and holding powerful institutions accountable. The Meridian executives had been sentenced to prison terms ranging from 8 to 15 years. CEO David Harrison, who had cooperated with prosecutors, received a lighter sentence of 5 years, but was banned from serving as an officer of any public company. The criminal convictions had sent a message throughout the pharmaceutical industry that fraud would be prosecuted aggressively. More importantly, the reforms inspired by Maria's case were beginning to prevent similar misconduct. Independent safety monitoring had already identified cardiovascular risks in 2 drugs before they reached market, preventing potential disasters like glycoes. Enhanced financial oversight had detected accounting manipulation at multiple companies before investors were harmed. Standing in her new office at the Government Accountability Office, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline, Maria felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced during her corporate career. She was no longer just an accountant reviewing spreadsheets. She was a guardian of public health and safety, using her expertise to protect vulnerable patients from corporate greed. The work was difficult and sometimes dangerous. Pharmaceutical companies still employed private investigators and aggressive legal tactics to intimidate potential whistleblowers. Maria continued to receive occasional threats and had to maintain security measures to protect her family. But she was no longer alone. A network of current and former pharmaceutical employees had formed around her, sharing information and supporting each other through the challenges of speaking truth to power. Dr. Kim had become a close friend and collaborator, while Rebecca Torres continued to provide legal guidance to the growing community of pharmaceutical whistleblowers. The insulin price-fixing investigation was just beginning, but Maria was confident that the system she and her allies had built would ultimately prevail. Each case built on the previous one, creating precedents and procedures that made it easier for future whistleblowers to come forward safely and effectively. As she prepared for another long night of reviewing financial documents and clinical trial data, Maria thought about her mother's word from that Sunday afternoon that seemed so long ago. Sometimes doing the right thing costs us everything, but the cost of doing nothing is even higher. The cost had indeed been enormous, but so had the impact. Thousands of patients were safer because of the reforms Maria's case had inspired. Billions of dollars in fraudulent schemes have been exposed and stopped. A culture of accountability was slowly taking root in an industry that had operated with impunity for too long. Maria Santos had found her true calling not in the comfortable corporate suite where she had started her career, but in the halls of justice where she continued to fight for patients and investors who depended on others to protect them from those who would put profits before human lives. The decimal point that changed her life had ultimately changed an entire industry, and the ripple effects would continue for years to come.